Every generation has that you remember exactly where you were moment. Pearl Harbor, the JFK assassination. Mine, and probably yours, was of course 9/11. I will spare you the boring story of recounting everything that I remember from that day. My story would probably sound a lot like yours. But one moment sticks in my mind, and I have found myself remembering it for the last few weeks since the United States bombed 3 nuclear sites in Iran. On the morning of 9/11, my mom and I stood in front of the TV. We watched the second plane hit. My mom gasped, and a minute later, she looked down at me, probably sensing that I did not fully grasp the gravity of the situation, and said, "Our country will be at war until you are an adult." Turns out she was right. I don't need to rehash the play-by-play of what came next for our country and the world. We all know the story well by now, of how the global war on terror captured us in a riptide of history and like a raft threw us head first into the rocks of the world we're living in now. It may have been impossible to see exactly where this geopolitical inertia was going to take us at the time, but that changed as soon as it became obvious to everyone that America's war on terror was never going to be confined to just Afghanistan. This culminated in what quickly became one of the most consequential speeches of the early 21st century, what has been dubbed the Axis of Evil speech. In that speech, then President George W. Bush laid out his administration's philosophy about what was then our new geopolitical reality. He explicitly labeled Iraq, North Korea, and Iran as being the 3 pillars in an axis of evil, which he added, quote, threaten the peace of the world. The idea of some explicit agreement between these nations might have come as a bit of a surprise to them, but more importantly, this axis of evil framing set the stage for the direction that American foreign policy has more or less followed, regardless of the party in power, for the last 20 years. And when the historians of the far future finally put pen to paper to tell the story of our era, this speech will be seen as a key inflection point of what was to come. The world we are living in today is one that is dangerously close to toppling the first domino in a chain reaction that could lead us into World War III. Iran was in America's foreign policy crosshairs long before the Bush Axis of Evil speech. And by now, we are well used to a world where Israel and the United States routinely target Iran's proxies all over the region. So often, it rarely even makes the news cycle. But since October 7th, 2023, a direct, all-out war between Israel and Iran has been a ticking time bomb, and a scenario with Israel bombing Tehran or Iran bombing Tel Aviv was seen as a would-be line-in-the-sand moment that would demonstrate a clear escalation in the conflict. Up until June 13th, there was still some hope that it might not come to that. But in reality, whatever hope there was that Iran and Israel would not start bombing each other outright was short-lived, if not misplaced entirely. The logistics of the attack itself are telling. Politics aside, look at Israel's attack from an operational standpoint alone. The level of success Israel achieved right out of the gate is stunning. Israel is widely considered to have one of the most effective foreign intelligence operations in the world, but even they could not have orchestrated an attack that eliminated nearly all of Iran's top-ranking military, science, and nuclear officials in a matter of hours without many months, likely years, of planning. This is a fight we all knew was coming. But what came next, America's level of involvement, still remained an open question. That question was answered when the United States bombed 3 Iranian nuclear facilities on June 22nd. The reason this stood out is because Bush II Obama and Biden all, in one way or another, agreed that America favored a diplomacy-first approach to the Iran nuclear question. How exactly the diplomacy-first approach played out from there was much less clear, but they at least agreed on the goal. When it comes to our current president, interestingly, his approach is still kind of an open question. A decent argument could be made that Trump also preferred this diplomacy-first plan too, at least initially. On the other hand, some experts have made the case that Trump's last round of nuclear negotiations with Iran were actually a diversion tactic to allow Israel to set up their surprise attack. When you watch history play out in real time, sometimes you have to resign yourself to the fact that you won't always be able to see the full picture from your vantage point. So for now, we'll leave that question of Trump's intentions to the historians. But as interesting as that question may be, it's almost not relevant anymore. The diplomacy-first strategy failed. The U.S. is involved. But the question still stands. To what degree? Before we move on, I want to get a few things out of the way. Number one, you might hear from some corners of the internet that there is some skepticism about whether or not Iran was even working towards a nuclear weapon to begin with. I absolutely understand this question. I am a child of the Iraq War, and given how egregiously we were lied to about weapons of mass destruction then, I am sympathetic. But, that said, the world is quite literally full of people who know a lot more about Iran's nuclear program than you or me, and they all agree that Iran was absolutely working towards a nuclear weapon, or at least building breakout weapons capability. So, unless there's some pretty strong new evidence to the contrary, I have no reason to doubt that that's the case, and I would suggest you shouldn't either. Number two, you might have some very strong opinions about Israel and its place in the world and in the Middle East specifically. You, like me, and like just about everyone on Earth, likely have some very strong opinions about Palestine. I can understand all of those opinions. Reasonable people can agree and disagree on all of that. But that just isn't what this show is about. There is no shortage of smart people out there diving deep on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And my hat's off to them because that is a tough gig. But that is just not what we're doing here. And number three, and this might actually be the most controversial, and that is that Iran simply cannot have a nuclear weapon. Regardless of how you feel about the Iran-Israel war, regardless of how you feel about Israel itself, about Palestine, about October 7th, or about Israel's influence on sectors of the American government through groups like AIPAC or whatever, I can understand all of those concerns. But there is a reality about the world that simply cannot be avoided, and it actually doesn't have much, if anything, to do with Iran specifically. It is simply a fact that the world becomes exponentially more dangerous every time another country obtains a nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapons are the only technology humankind possesses with the capability to end the human story in an afternoon. Nothing else comes close. Not climate change, not AI for now, not wide-scale economic devastation. Nothing short of a supervolcano eruption or an asteroid impact has the same devastating capabilities as full-scale nuclear war. Every time another country gets added to the roster of this semi-exclusive nuclear club, the chances of something going wrong skyrockets. So be it Iran or any other country, the world cannot afford to sit idly by while more and more countries pursue these weapons. With the stakes that high, we need to be working towards a world with less nukes, not more. In fact, that was a given for older generations of Americans, especially during the Cold War. But every day, more and more of those Cold Warriors die, and for the ones in government, the loss of their institutional wisdom goes with them. Eventually, there will come a day where no one in the government is alive to remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, or even the Cold War. Don't get me wrong, I am by no means mourning the loss of the Ronald Reagans of the world per se, but I fear that as that generation ages out, we're starting to forget that we live with a constant nuclear sword of Damocles dangling over our heads, and that if we aren't careful, the thread could snap at any moment. That isn't going to change. And as a species, we have a tendency to create more and more technologies that pose an existential risk to our own survival. Right now, nuclear weapons are humanity's one technology that could end civilization in an afternoon. What happens when we have two technologies that can do that? How about 5? It doesn't take long before the odds of something going terribly wrong are no longer in our favor. So for that reason alone, Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon is just too dangerous for the world as a whole, regardless of the politics. And at the time of writing, the American government agrees, and that decision is being shown via targeted airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, there seems to be some questions about how effective those strikes even were. But either way, as of right now, America has not decided to get more involved. Let's hope for all our sakes that continues to be the case. But as important as it is for the world to not let Iran or any other country, much less an authoritarian one, obtain nuclear weapons, we have to remember that all of this is still a sideshow. And when the historians, with that great benefit of hindsight, look back on this moment in global history, it may look more like an opening salvo than a history-shifting inflection point. That's because this sideshow pales in comparison to the main event. And that main event is China. You've probably heard some version of the nightmare scenario before. The scenario where Iran, China, Russia, possibly North Korea or others all band together in a revenge of the Axis powers style agreement to fight America and her allies in a multi-front war. This is the true doomsday World War III scenario that has occupied the minds of conspiracy theorists and institutional ivory tower analysts alike for years. The idea goes that should a war of that magnitude break out, not only would the question of Western hegemony be at risk, but the question of the continuation of the human story might be too. So if you aren't familiar, the hypothesis goes something like this. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and maybe some others like Venezuela all team up and collectively attack America at once. Russia invades Ukraine or Poland, Iran attacks Israel, China invades Taiwan, maybe all three of them gang up and attack the US all at once. The exact configuration in this scenario varies, but the important part is that in this scenario, America and her allies have no choice but to react, but they're stretched too thin to fight back decisively. In this hellish chain of events, America is then all but forced to resort to using nuclear weapons. Her enemies respond in kind by using their own, and just like that, Einstein's quote about World War IV being fought with sticks and stones becomes humanity's new reality, assuming there's anyone around to see it. Astute listeners will of course recognize that we have 2 out of the 3 on that checklist already, and this is why the stakes of the US hitting Iran are so high. Not because Iran poses a unique threat to the Western world on its own, but because our increased involvement there has the potential to be yet another heavy straw on the proverbial camel's back. And when this camel collapses, humankind might go with it. I'll be the first to point out that this scenario actually happening in the real world is extremely unlikely. There is nothing written in the stars that even says the US would have to get in a war with China over Taiwan, say. I think there's essentially no chance the US would ever put boots on the ground in Ukraine, and frankly, maybe not even Poland. And as of right now, the US hasn't further escalated in Iran. But as unlikely as this nightmare scenario may be, it's not impossible. And when the stakes are high enough to put the long-term survival of our species at risk, there really are no odds I'm willing to bet on. Thankfully for us, there are some real-world barriers preventing this nightmare scenario from becoming a nightmare reality. One key fact that seldom makes its way into the conversation around this imagined 21st century Axis 2.0 is that the only thing these countries hate almost as much as a global Western hegemony led by the United States is each other. Neither China or Russia are known for being particularly trusting countries. They also happen to both be nuclear powers that share a nearly 3,000-mile border. So it should come as no surprise that behind the warm handshakes and flashy press conferences, behind closed doors, they don't trust each other at all. But you don't have to take my word for it. In 2025, the New York Times obtained a leaked Russian intelligence document that labeled China as, quote, the enemy and a serious national security threat. This leaked memo even outlined how China continues to target Russian scientists, steal sensitive technology, and even spies on Russia's military, including military operations in Ukraine. We in America certainly know what that's like. Now, is it possible that these two countries could put aside their differences and temporarily work together to take out the United States in some dystopian Hollywood movie-style alternate reality? Maybe. But on the ground, things tend to play out much differently when times get tough. And that takes us back to the question of Iran. Neither China nor Russia, nor really much of anyone, has stepped up to Iran's defense after Israel and then the United States started dropping bombs. It's early days, of course, but there really isn't any evidence to suggest that anyone will. In fact, all evidence that there is points to the contrary. Writing for The Atlantic, Leon Aaron writes, in calmer times, China, like Russia, is happy to use Iran as a battering ram against the US and its allies. But when tensions turn into military confrontation and global security is at risk, backing Iran looks like a far less sensible investment to Beijing than preserving its own economic and diplomatic relations with the West. This isn't just a problem for Iran, though, as Aaron argues, adding, China's mild reaction isn't just a blow to Iran. It may also suggest that the much ballyhooed no-limits partnership between Xi and Russia's President Vladimir Putin might not be as sturdy as Moscow and Beijing advertise. Russia and China, like everyone on Earth, know full well that Iran doesn't necessarily need much of a reason to instigate a war with Israel, and that war is almost certainly one that the US would get more involved in. It's hard to believe that there would have ever been much in the way of a true deal on something like this to begin with, but if we want to give this famed three-pronged nightmare scenario any credence, then the assumption is that there could have been at least an understanding on the part of this potential Axis 2.0 that if they could sufficiently divide the West's attention, with Russia attacking Ukraine, Iran attacking Israel, and maybe in Act 3, China attacking Taiwan, they may be able to divide America and Europe's attention just enough to weaken NATO's ability to work in unison. We don't want to give anyone any ideas, but in another reality, this dystopian Hollywood thriller might be pretty interesting. Now, I want to reiterate, I do not think there was some kind of smoke-filled room in Beijing or some secret phone call where something like this was explicitly hashed out. But nevertheless, the true danger of this moment that the United States finds itself in with regards to Iran cannot be ignored. Because if the United States does get sucked into yet another, likely decades-long conflict in the Middle East, it's hard to imagine a world where Xi Jinping does not take that opportunity to invade Taiwan eventually. And when that happens, there's only two ways the US could respond. We could do nothing, or we could fight for it. Neither is a good option if your overarching goal is a world where humankind at large is freer, more prosperous, and more peaceful. We all know the stories about Taiwan's strategic importance. Semiconductor manufacturing, of which Taiwan is home to somewhere around 90% of, is essentially the 21st century equivalent of oil. Advanced economies simply can't live without it, and to hand it to China without a fight is, so the thinking goes, synonymous with essentially handing them global economic dominance for the foreseeable future. Letting that happen without a fight is just not how the US does business. The other option is much more likely, as we all know by now, and that is that we fight for it. Hashing out the play-by-play of what would happen should China invade Taiwan is not particularly important for this conversation. The halls of the internet are filled with detailed scenarios about war games of every stripe, enough content to keep you entertained and horrified for hours. But what is important is the sheer level of destruction. No one thinks a war of this magnitude would be quick or small. Without question, a conflict like this would suck in other powers. Without question, a conflict like this would kill, at minimum, probably millions of people. Depending on how it ends, probably more. The risk of something like this cascading into a nuclear conflict would be almost unavoidable. Even if by some stroke of luck, the United States and China both listened to their better angels and refrained from using nuclear weapons at some point in this conflict, a tall order indeed, there would be no guarantee that a quote-unquote rogue state would follow suit. North Korea, for example, is right there. And when the level of chaos in a regional conflict of that size hits a fever pitch, all bets are off. In this situation, the chances that the world sleepwalks or gets dragged kicking and screaming into a full-scale nuclear annihilation aren't far-fetched. They're likely. Now, let's take a step back for just a moment. There are a lot of ifs in this nightmare scenario, none of which are impossible or even improbable, but none of which are written in stone either. And that is usually a good signal that it is a useful time to pause and zoom the lens of history out as far as we can. What do all wars in human history have in common? Perhaps the most important thing is that they act as a catalyst, a historical riptide that has the tendency to drag us in directions we never thought possible, often without us noticing till it's too late. And like a riptide, we can often feel like we are in control for a while. We can feel like we're riding the waves and slowly but surely making our way towards shore. But in an instant, the invisible current beneath our feet can drag us out to sea and bury us in the undertow. If our collective goal as a species is the continuation of the human story, then everything we do on the global stage needs to be in alignment with that ultimate goal. One of the tragedies of our era is that the world, and more specifically our political leaders, seem to be either uninterested or incapable of seeing more than a few moves ahead on the geopolitical chessboard. It is a miracle that humanity made it through the Cold War without falling into full-scale nuclear war, sometimes even by accident. But as we sleepwalk closer and closer to a situation that might again put the continuation of the human story at risk, the question we should all be asking is how many times can we play with fire till we eventually get burned?